A common idea in the Abrahamic faiths is the idea that God is so holy and so just that he cannot tolerate evil at all. Thus, he is justified in condemning people to everlasting torment in hell because the offense of an infinitely holy being rightly deserves infinite punishment. God is so infinitely holy and so just, and we are so wretched and depraved that the amazing thing in the eyes of many believers is that he allows us to live and does not wipe us all out. The theologian and preacher Jonathan Edwards famously emphasized this point in one of the most famous sermons of the Great Awakening titled Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, in which he terrified 18th century listeners with the idea that it was only God's patience and grace that kept them from the much-deserved fires of hell. Muslims have a similar view. They say that Allah is the most merciful and the most just. A quote I read summed up the Islamic position rather well when it said, "Every punishment from Allah is pure justice and every blessing from him is pure grace." The problem with this thinking is that while on the surface it gives human beings someone to whom they are ultimately accountable to, and some kind of measuring rod by which to determine an action's morality, it utterly fails to do the same thing for the deity. How do we determine whether God's actions are moral, and what standard we are to judge it by? What's more, how can we argue that it is just to decree an infinite punishment for a finite transgression? For example, a teenager walks into a store and steals something, let's say a video game. Upon finding this out, his parents are understandably upset and force him to make amends to the shop owner by working off his debt. After he has done so, he has learned his lesson and is a better person. But if God exists as understood by the Abrahamic faiths and judges this teenager by sending him to hell, his infinite punishment is in no way proportional to the amount of impact that theft has had. I mean, you steal one thing and you burn for all eternity. How is that justice? What's more, it doesn't allow any form of learning or growth to happen because the punishment lasts forever. Some might argue that their favorite scriptures confirm that their God is good. But if their God has truly inspired these prophets, then these scriptures are hardly unbiased sources. Therefore, it can be argued that we would have no objective way of determining whether God's actions are truly moral or if said deity is truly omnibenevolent. Ironically, Christian apologists provide no transcendent source to objectively confirm whether their God's actions are moral, yet always argue that atheists can't have a basis for objective morality. Some believers might refer to the divine command apologetic that is popular among some Christian thinkers, as well as some other religious believers, and which I covered in an earlier part of this series. The idea basically being that whatever God says is moral, no matter how repugnant it may seem to our reasoning. As I said before, this just leaves us with unquestioning obedience, not a rationally evaluated system of ethics. But many believers embrace this. Some Christians openly embrace this, calling themselves slaves of Christ, and even the word Islam itself means submission to Allah's will. Many will also say that God had different standards for judging morality in olden times than he does now. This is how many of the Abrahamic traditions justify the passages in their holy book where their God condones things that modern reasoning has determined to be immoral. In other words, God is cool with human trafficking when it involves defenseless Midianite virgins, but he totally supports modern Christianity's attempts to end it. Or he's against murder, but it's praiseworthy when he tells Egypt's Pharaoh that he's going to kill his firstborn, and then does it. Continuing on this point, if we take it a step forward and extend the logic, we realize that it's not only undermining the very concept of absolute morality that many believers attempt so desperately to uphold, but it also implies that God does not hold himself to the same standards that he holds us to. In other words, he is a do as I say, not as I do parent. Even more so, if we say that God was working within the context of the time and saying, for example, that he doesn't really condone human trafficking but was working with the flawed Hebrews mindset, how can we say that he is so holy that he can't tolerate evil? God puts prohibitions on all sorts of things in the Mosaic Law, both understandable and ridiculous. How much harder would it be to say, "Thou shalt not abduct virgin little girls and keep them for yourself. It is an abomination." What's more, if we say that God was willing to abide with or even regulate a practice that many of his most devout modern followers recognize as a great evil, then how can we say that he is infinitely more just than us and therefore can judge us? The next video in this series will be the conclusion. I hope you'll be watching it.